All right, Khari. When I say diversity in journalism, what does that mean to you personally?
Well, it means having, to I guess use the same word again, having diversity of perspective. So, um, and that's naturally, in my view, reflected in the type of person that you're bringing in, and where they come from, and ethnicity and race. I kind of hesitate to use race in that standpoint because I feel like it's kind of a manufactured construct. But
Hmm.
um, your ethnic background, that matters because whether people like it or not, that shapes your outlook. It certainly did for me, because of the way that people reacted to me, and kind of the way I interacted with the world around me. It was very influenced by, me being a person of color. Whereas like, I'm a black man, but, I have a different perspective than, somebody who grew up like in the hood, you know what I mean? Or grew up around like in an all black background and things. But there's I think that there has to be an element of having people from all different walks of life and all different kinds of communities. I feel like there's a certain honesty in reporting that comes from that because it's hard for somebody who is not familiar with very urban areas and very like predominantly black areas. There's something that's not quite genuine about it if you're always sending white people who have never been
Right.
around that kind of thing in their entire life, and they're interpreting things a certain way, but it's sometimes can be based on preconceived notions that they have as opposed to understanding the plight of the people that are there. So I think that it really is a matter of understanding like where you are, whether like you're in a big city, or a small town or something like that. Understanding the makeup of where you are and representing accurately the people in it. And if you're going to be talking about things, on a countrywide scale, then you need to have a lot of people, in your department that can speak the language of many different kinds of people.
That you're 27, right?
28.
28. Okay, so that's your answer now. Has that shifted? Was your answer different any number of years ago? How working your way to this conclusion, working your way to this thought process?
I think that it was something that I didn't know how to articulate that well.
Okay.
So when I was in journalism, in high school, right, it was a very different deal. I'm reporting on things that are happening in my high school, or I was very focused on science as opposed to community issues. It was very much kind of an individual, sort of endeavor. At the same time, looking back on it, I can tell you that there weren't very many, black people in my student publications, class either. And, I think that I just kind of, I internalized that a lot in terms of where I grew up because I didn't grow up around very many people of color at all, growing up in
Right.
Hobart, Indiana. And so the issues in communities of color, or the idea that we're going to mix in Hobart with people of color was seen as an unfortunate thing. And so I think that people were kind of they didn't want that and wanted to avoid it as much as possible. Though there's a fairly, there's been a developing, community of color, in that realm of Northwest Indiana. It's been happening for years, and things like that. So to kind of get back to the crux of the question, I always felt that my view of the world,
Hmm.
and my voice, my interests, my experience wasn't represented by where I grew up. And it wasn't represented in the people that were writing news in my hometown. and the people that were prominently speaking out. And so I think that going out into the world a little bit, going away to college, going into the real world, I guess, and seeing so much of the same has kind of galvanized that perspective,
Hmm.
because it's followed me everywhere I go. Like, this is just, it's very, pervasive throughout our society as a whole. And, being involved in journalism has made me see that more clearly, because there are so many issues in, Black culture, Latino culture, that are misrepresented because they're not being told by the right people. So I would say, um, my answer hasn't so much changed as it has become clearer.
Was you was you growing up in such a is the right word, homogenized, right? Where
Yeah,
it's,
homogenous. Yeah.
yeah, or homogenous area that, where you didn't have the perspective of different people of color. Was that your personal primary motivation in pursuing a journalistic career? Because you wanted to offer that perspective because you didn't want uh, future generations to feel perhaps as outcast maybe as you were.
I would say, because my journalism career, kind of began so much later, I think that that wasn't necessarily how I arrived at that. Though I think that, as now that I'm in this, kind of career, and I got to go to National Association of Black Journalists conference a couple of years ago. Having seen that, it absolutely is a motivation for me now, as opposed to when I first started out kind of blogging and just trying to put my voice out there. On
Mm-hmm.
the other hand, um, coming from a science background, I see so many of the same issues that affect science uh, like fields of science, whether it's, graduate school or just like, science industry. So much of that feels familiar to me, as far as my path to journalism, because there's a lot of underrepresentation in STEM fields. And I think that was a motivation for me when I was coming up as a scientist. And it's something that I tell a lot of kids, kids that I've mentored or parents that I've talked to, is you're gonna, your kids are gonna feel alone if they go to an institution of higher learning, and they're going to be trying to push themselves through this field, and maybe become a professor, or get an advanced degree. The higher up you get, the fewer people like you you're gonna see. And depending on,
Right.
where you started out from, that might be nothing by the time you get to the top. I know, like, there really wasn't a whole lot of that for me. And so I had that perspective, from a science, kind of perspective first. And then when I was switching over to journalism, I think it started out as a more like, I just want to do this because I feel like this is something that, I have a strength in. But then, when I got to look at it a little bit more closely, and seeing the newsroom I'm in now, it's a great place to work, but also kind of lacking in diversity, on a quantitative level, especially. Uh, yeah, it's absolutely a big deal to me, to be a Black journalist, and to represent that to the people who come after me, because you know,
Wait, when you say come after, what do you mean by come after you?
um,
Oh,
you know,
you mean like you're a mentor? Never mind. Sorry. Okay.
yeah, yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah, me as a mentor, people who might want to join this field, and this is something that, again, with science, I did a lot of mentorship, and I had an opportunity to meet with kids who maybe science wasn't really something they had thought about before, or maybe it was, but they just didn't know what the hell to do, how to get into it.
Mm.
because that was my experience. I didn't know how to be a scientist. I had no idea how to do any of this, and I had to find my own way. And that's tough. And that's part of the reason why a lot of people don't make it in these fields, because they don't have somebody to mentor them. They don't have somebody who understands their plight and knows how to relate to them. So I think that it's important for people like me, people like Evan, who you talked to, yesterday, people like Jay, who's, been, kind of like a slight mentor to me. We talked a little bit since we met. It's important for us to, when we see kids, kids of color coming up in the journalistic ranks, and they start to see this unseen barrier, we got to help them find a way to get past it.
It's interesting that you actually say that, because a specific study, I mean, it's not necessarily a new study, but this was something I was going to throw out. A recent study found that people of color, women, LGBTQ people, especially in journalism, and just on an overall level, they're less likely to have professional mentors. They're less likely to have those kinds of references they can lean on for jobs, those kinds of references they can lean on for guidance and advice as they progress through whatever they're pursuing, not even limited just to journalism.
Right.
Outside of Jay, who's a recent mentor, correct? That's someone you've met like within.
Yeah.
Okay. So did you have a mentor?
I've got to be completely honest with you. No. In terms of, especially like my path to journalism, I did that all on my own. And in large part, with science, I did that mostly on my own as well. And that, again, like, people might look at that and say, oh, wow, great. You're so driven, and, more people should be like you. But it's missing the point. That's not an easy thing to do. And truthfully, there are times when I didn't know. I spent most of my time not knowing what I was doing in trying to become a scientist. And definitely once I decided I wanted to be a journalist, I didn't know how to be a journalist either. Like and that's part of the thing. Like, me being where I am right now is like crazy to me sometimes, to think about where I am versus where I was just a year ago, or a year and a half ago. Like, I could not have imagined this. And that's part of the problem. When you are trying to accomplish something that not many people like you typically accomplish, or you're going into a field where there aren't many, people like you, it's going to be hard to find mentors that get you. It's like, yeah, you like, maybe they're are mentors that you can have. It doesn't always have to be a person of color. It's just that, when again, like, I use this analogy a lot, or like this scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Kids see basketball stars, football stars, rappers, entertainers, celebrities who are Black. And that is an example of somebody who it's like, yeah, that person looks like me and they kind of do the things I like. I want to be like that person. Right. So it's like when I was mentoring kids in Chicago, in science outreach programs, they would be walking around with basketballs all the time, doing crossovers and stuff like that on the sidewalk. They wanted to be Derrick Rose. They didn't want to be a scientist. How many Black scientists can you think of, that are prominent off the top of your head? I mean, they're if you look for them, you can find some great ones, but they're not prominent, right? They're not really uplifted and put out there. And in terms of Black journalists, right? Like, the one that I really remember from my childhood anyway was Stuart Scott. Like that, like he was like one of the first, like, kind of, journalists, like media type figures, who I felt like I could look at that dude and he was cool, and he talked like people I know talk, like he, somebody like on my family, like I could just like, relate to. But how many other people could I think of off the top of my head that were like that? Not many. And
Right.
so when you grow up like that, and it's really just incumbent on you to make your own path, because you don't have somebody who's ahead of you that you can really look to as an example, or you're trying to look to certain people as an example and you're trying to learn from them, but you feel like that they to an extent don't get you, because I've had that experience, particularly in science, and I felt like that was really hurtful to my scientific career. um, that's tough, and that's tough in no matter what profession that you're trying to go for.
That's again a common theme, and even with someone like Stuart Scott, that's someone that Evan mentioned too, like where you can't really like Stuart Scott's was a big permanent or a big permeating personality on ESPN, but that's the thing, like you can't name someone outside of ESPN, outside of a sports realm. You can't let I feel like, and that's kind of a theme that Evan also reverberated on, and I guess I don't think you really gave it, like, what do you personally attribute to this? Like, because this is such a nuanced issue of a lack of mentorship, of a lack of role models. That whole theme. Why do you think it's this way? Why do you think it's this way that young black men and women, people of color, whatever, don't have that access? What do you how do you see it?
Well, I feel in a lot of ways it starts with, um, it starts with education, and it starts with, um, I don't want to say upbringing necessarily,
Right.
but with kind of the environment, and that you grow up in. And I say that because, well, first of all, when you're going to school and stuff like that, you go through your general classes and stuff, but sometimes there are after school programs, or things that you can do in the summer that some people have monetary access to. Their parents can pay for that. They can transport them, and kind of make sure they have all this extra nurturing. Not everybody gets that. And the other thing being that, in some of these schools, it was really unfortunate. Um, like schools that I had mentored kids in with science, but it probably could have gone for any other number of things. Is the teachers are just trying to get through the day, and they're not necessarily like, not everything is very inspiring. Like, they're not like
Right.
trying to stoke real deep genuine interests in in science or history, or any of that. And so these kids are just kind of looking at it like, they know, they understand that, just get the work, just get the homework done, get the quiz done, and we're good to go. So there's no, in a lot of cases, there's no program. There's no one to really challenge you to think just beyond what's in the textbook. And that, I feel like, is the tough thing, because so much of really stoking this interest is having a reason, having something that you want to study outside of the classroom, or something that you want to practice outside of the classroom. For a lot of people, that's sports, but it could be science, it could be journalism, and all that. And just generally, I think that, um, I just have so many thoughts that I'm like trying to collect
No,
it
go
really.
ahead. That's what this is for.
Yeah. But
Go ahead. If
when I
you're
was
holding
with,
back something, feel free.
it's just like when I was working with these kids, some of
Okay.
these subjects are intimidating to them. Whether it's science, or history,
When you're talking about kids that you
you know
mentored.
yeah,
Okay.
writing and journalism, and the subjects are intimidating, but they need someone who is able to help them connect to it, and just be like, you know what, like it's not that bad. It's not that hard. Just express yourself. Just let that curiosity roam and get out there. And it's just, some of it is that, just kind of not having, that person who can, do that for you to kind of, mentor you, through that, and to get you to, think outside the box. And some of it is the monetary thing. Some of it is just, whether it's like you're living, for some of these kids, like they're living with their grandparents, or they're in a single parent household and their parents are working two jobs, or they're living with their grandmother and they are, struggling health wise, and, the kids have to help take care of them. Like there are so many reasons why, or even if we're talking about college, right? And this is something that I had issues with too. I went to University of Chicago, but there's no way I would have been able to go if I didn't get financial aid. I was
Right.
fortunate. And for some of these kids that, I've, worked with in the past, it's like they're smart. They're smart, creative kids, but they're looking at places like University of Chicago or Notre Dame and all these top schools that they are easily qualified for, and like, we can't afford that. And so that dream kind of falls by the wayside. And it really is just kind of like, it's all part of this system, where people of color, more often than not, tend to be disadvantaged because of the history that we have in this country. And we have a long way to climb out of that. And it's difficult to necessarily see the end of it. And it's producing, this environment where kids who are smart and talented can't see the light, and I think that people take for granted that everybody just gets the same opportunities and everybody has access to the same teachers, the same resources, the same education, the same family environment. And it really feels sometimes like you got a strike or two against you just coming out, to get to that point. And so, obviously then, right, when you don't have a lot of people matriculating through the ranks to be in positions of mentorship in the first place, well then, it's hard to, find anybody to look up to, for the people that come after.
Let's come back to this conversation. I want to start doing a little bit of your profile. Khari, give me a elevator speech or a blanket statement describing yourself as a professional. So what that entails is, and this is just for the recording itself and quote, give me your name, give me your age, and give me your current employment. Give me how you would describe yourself as a journalist or as a thought leader, provoker, what have you. And then I will envelop off of that. I obviously have preset questions as well, but give me your elevator speech about Khari Thompson as he stands.
Well, hopefully it doesn't sound too boring. So I'm Khari Thompson, 28 years old. I am the field producer for the Morning Edition show at WBUR in Boston. I work with Bob Oakes, who's been the host at Morning Edition for 25 years. So as a journalist, I love to be, kind of analytical and deep thinking. I like to ask, questions that get to the roots of the problem. I'm the kind of person that wants to explain everything to you to my detriment sometimes. I will take, I'll give you long-winded answers. I will, try to give you every last detail that I can think of. But at the same time, I don't want to, I'm the kind of journalist that doesn't want to divorce myself from the human aspect. I want to explain people. I want to look deeper into what makes people tick. And I also want to give people like me, to help give people like me a voice, to explain what's going on in their communities and to help bring people up with me.
you mentioned growing up in Hobart, Indiana, correct?
Yeah.
How did you progress to a point where uh, you wanted to pursue science at University of Chicago, and then you went to Notre Dame as well after the fact, after for
Yeah.
graduate, I
Hmm.
assume.
Yeah.
So how did all of that envelop? How did you go from science to journalism? Um, you you mentioned being self-made. I'd imagine for most of this. So I can't imagine it was just a straight yellow brick road. Like there was just a lot of zigging and zagging all over the place.
Well, I started off as just a kid who loved dinosaurs and I wanted to study them. And, that was my motivation growing up, was just to be a paleontologist. And that was something that my family had no idea how to respond to. They didn't know how to encourage me. So I just took the reins and kind of did it on my own. My family kind of helped me through school to a certain point, but after a while, I just did my own thing and got the grades on my own. Um, at the same time, I did have kind of a concurrent love for journalism and history. Um, and so I did student publications when I was in high school. I thought maybe journalism would be a good career for me, or something involving like law. I enjoyed debating. I enjoyed um, expressing my thoughts on the history of our country, and the history of the world. And so that was always a piece of me that I enjoyed, but I had a lot of inertia towards science. So I pursued that and I got to do what I wanted. I got to study dinosaurs. Um, and then ultimately, I felt like I started shifting more and more back to what I felt like was applicable stuff to people. So I went from dinosaurs to studying modern animals, kind of how they eat, how they develop, skeletally, because I was always studying skulls and things like that. So how things kind of develop from like embryo stages and things. So I was all about the skeleton and all that fun stuff. Uh, but writing in graduate school, so like I do have a first author paper from when I was in graduate school. Um, so I am a published scientific author. That's kind of fun to
Ooh,
mention. Um,
in
but
what? In what?
um,
I don't know how that works exactly. So you're gonna have to
so
give me.
so I have a paper on uh, like skull biomineralization. So basically, just like skull development in mice. So I had it published in the journal Zoology.
The American Journal of Zoology. What is the
It's
exact
just
title?
called Zoology.
Okay, okay. And this was in at University of Chicago or Notre Dame.
So this was at Notre Dame.
Okay, okay,
So when I was in graduate school.
okay.
So I got my master's in biology from there. Um, and so writing in graduate school was something that was a really tortured experience. I felt like I didn't enjoy it at all. And so eventually I just wanted to get back to writing things I like to write about. So I started blogging a little bit just on my own about football. I did a couple of little fun posts here and there, and then I showed that stuff to ShyCitySports.com. With Zach Pearson over there, and he gave me a shot to write for his site, and I really, really enjoyed that and got into it. And he gave me the opportunity to go to Chicago Bears camp, so that was fun. And I think
Mm,
that from there um, I got the bug, and I felt like throughout that time I rediscovered what my true strengths were, which are writing and um, having an even keeled perspective on things. Because I feel like a lot of people um, have a tendency to just kind of spout things with no facts, or they just want to have a take. I'm not just about having a take. I try to see the different sides of the argument, let the numbers tell the story, and give you something measured, because I think that that's what real discussion is. It's not just saying some shit, and throwing it out there. Um, so that was what I felt I was really good at. So when I got my master's degree in science, I didn't go back. I decided I wanted to go into journalism, and I took a flyer, on National Association of Black Journalists from a friend of mine who worked at ESPN at the time. So he was actually producing at the time for Jamel Hill and uh, Michael Smith's morning, the Sports Center at 6,
Mm-hmm.
SC6. So he turned me on to go to this conference. I went, and it was one of the most impactful things I've done in my entire life. I went to this place that truthfully I'd never been in a room with that many Black people at the same time in my entire life, which is crazy. But that tells you also a lot about where I grew up. And everybody was just so incredible and supportive. And we all really felt like we were just in this together, trying to help each other advance. And the friends that I made there, I still have a lot of people that I know and still talk to. But the other thing that happened there was I ran into John Davidow from WBUR. He's a managing editor there. And I got to talking with him about public radio. I didn't know that I was going to get into public radio at the time. I was obviously looking at the ESPNs and the NFL networks and things like that because I'm a sports guy, at heart. But I gave a lot of other spots a chance because I was just trying to find a way to get into this. And, I was going to take my shot, kind of no matter, maybe not no, like absolutely no matter where it was, but I was prepared to do that. And I found this guy with WBUR in Boston. We hit it off. We stayed in contact, and they brought me out in March for an interview.
March of last year.
Yeah, March of 2018. And I just try to put my best foot forward and really play up in a lot of ways my unique background. So I've talked so much about science in this, because that was where I started out. And that was the kind of experience that they enjoyed, because I wasn't just, a guy who went to journalism school and, kind of like, the majority of people. I took a different path, and it really influenced my writing, the way that I did things. And I think that it also did matter that I was a person of color. I was a little bit older. I had been in the real world. I had had several jobs. Um, and so, they created a fellowship for me to help get me in the building. And from there, it was all about me just doing my thing, to put it bluntly. I had to prove it. I had 6 months to try to get a job. I started out as a producer with a nationally televised show, or I said nationally televised, nationally broadcast radio show On Point. Um, I did that for 3 months. Then they moved me to the newsroom, and I really just felt like I clicked and took off from there. I got a chance to be on the air, and I think that it impressed all the right people, and got a chance to show that I could be a producer for the morning show. And so here I am. Um, that was kind of a long little bit of story, but
No, it's fun. It's perfect.
really it was just, I started out from a place where um, I already was doing things that nobody in my family had done and that nobody really understood. And they didn't know how to help me. So I had to help myself. And then when I was, in elementary school and, um, like middle school and things like that, like I felt like no one pushed me as hard as I could push myself. No one challenged me more than I could challenge myself. And I just kept pushing and pushing and pushing and spending late nights, trying to get my homework done, and also trying to further my own interests. Like, when I was a kid, I, um, did, media fairs, so I would create websites or create slideshow presentations, and I would compete, you know, in kind of little child media competitions. So I really started out more in media even than I gave myself credit for. So it's like being back in this environment in a way is like me coming full circle.
You mentioned your family didn't have as much influence on you. What what did your parents do? How many siblings do you have? Like what's their story in your story? Because like you also said that they kind of took you to a certain point financially through school as well. So, what did they teach you, if anything? What did they uh, help you along in this path to self discovery that you eventually just took yourself upon?
um, so
I know.
so originally, I kind of was a product of a single mom. My mom had
Okay,
me when she was in high school. My father, my biological father, was never really a big part of my life,
okay.
and so for a very long while, it was me and my mom and my grandparents, and so that was really all I had. And my mother, my mother is also a very creative person, very expressive, um, and well articulated, and all these things. And so I think that she, in a way, what like she didn't necessarily teach me, but I would read the things that she would write, and I would listen to her speak, and she would read things to me, and she encouraged me to delve into my history, and she never hid from me where I came from. She you know was never shy about telling me that I was black, and you know that my father wasn't in the picture, and this is why. And also the fact that we were living in Hobart, Indiana, for much of my life, and this is what it means to be black in Hobart, Indiana. And so there was
Mm.
always this element of her teaching me, just how life was. And she didn't she graduated from high school and got an associate's degree, but I feel like she always had more ambitions, and more, um, things she wanted to accomplish. And in a lot of ways, she endowed like some of that spirit on me. And she was relentless. Like, I feel like sometimes the way that she would work and the way that she pushed me, um, she did not let me slide on my grades. She would not let me do less than my best, and she taught me that sometimes you got to suffer through stuff. You have to take your shots on the chin, but you better not let anybody see you crying. Like, you
Mm.
have to be tough. And my dad, so my parents met after I was born. Technically my stepdad, but I mean, he's the only dad I got. uh, and so he, I get a lot of my very like staunch individualism from him, that I can kind of laser focus and tune everything out and just work my ass off all the time. He's not quite as fiery as my mom is, uh, but he was always just steady and dependable, and he would always just get things done. And he was always just determined to prove himself, to prove that, he could be relied on, to prove that he could do the job. And so it was just always about work, 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 work. Don't quit. Don't stop. Don't settle. Like that. That's what it was. Now, from kind of a cultural perspective, it was a little fraught at times because my mom was a little bit more earnest about telling me what I was and what that meant. My dad, uh, you know, his father was a white guy from Kentucky, but his mother actually was a full-blooded Mexican who was first generation in this country.
Mm.
Um, but he didn't identify with that heritage, and so he was just kind of like, "You're American, none of the rest matters," and kind of very much of this assumption that everything is equal. Um, and then it's just all about work and it's all about, what you earn. And to an extent, you know, that has its place and that is true. But so much of the treatment I received when I was a kid, that was a lie. It was clearly about what I was. People made it about that. And so I felt I had to bury myself in my work and in this relentless personality because that was the only way I could overcome all this other shit that people were, pulling on me. It was the only way I could silence the critics and the people who didn't expect that much from me. Um, my
You had to
brothers,
work. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
oh, sorry, my brothers, I have two of them. They're both younger. So they're both now, the middle one is 23 and the younger one is 22. So we're all, kind of older now. Um, they didn't necessarily, not that they weren't proud of their heritage, being Mexican and Puerto Rican, as well as, also a little bit, white as well. But, they just didn't experience the types of things I did because they just don't look like me. Um, and their treatment was also a little bit different by my parents because I think they felt they pushed me too hard and they didn't push them quite as much, like that kind of thing. Um, but they're good. They're good kids. They're good guys. It's just that it was a little different for us.
You say so you had to. You're saying you had to compensate for the barriers that were set upon by you by working basically probably twice as hard. Correct? Just to clarify.
Sometimes I felt that way. Or at the very least, the way that I was working, you know, and to kind of overcome things, whether it's on my homework or um, the way I presented myself, I was always fighting this perception of what people assumed that I was because I was black,
Right.
or like I had teachers, and stuff like that who were put off by me, when I was in middle school, especially because I wasn't a very smiley kid.
Mm.
And I did have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder because of some of the stuff that had happened to me and some of the stuff I'd put up with. And so, the thing that plagues me now, or the thing that I think about a lot in relation to my childhood is people people labeled me the angry black kid, but no one ever thought to ask why I was angry. No one ever cared about that part. Um, and I was mostly just trying to be on my own. Like I didn't lash out at people. I didn't treat anybody badly, or cause disruptions in class. Like I was a student and I was one of the best students, consistently in every class I was ever in.
Mm.
But, people looked at me a certain way because I was quiet and because I was always very aware of how different I was compared to everybody else. And I perceived that I was treated differently and I didn't like it. and so I distrusted people, and so that was a really tough thing, from middle school through high school, in terms of the way that people, you know, uh, talked about me and viewed me, and set my expectations.
Outside of that, and that's very, especially for a child, that sounds like such a, especially upon reflection, like such a traumatic a label to get past, like people, that people probably don't respect you enough because of just who you are, correct? And they don't want to inquire more. Um, Outside of that, as your professional career has developed, as your academic career developed, Khari, has there ever been, and you don't have to name names, but has there ever been a specific instance or instances where you've been discriminated against professionally or academically,
I
like
would
especially in
not.
a journalistic sense?
Yeah, I definitely, in my career in journalism, I've been blessed so far, my first couple of jobs, to work in very good environments, where I did not feel discriminated against. Um, my editors, my coworkers, like when I was at the South Bend Tribune and here at WBUR, the people are great. Um, I think that maybe to an extent I felt like when I was in science, that was a slightly different way. But uh, the only thing that I would say about in journalism is that um, this notion of lack of diversity has kind of showed itself once or twice in the way that people talk about, um, bringing guests onto the show. And there was this one incident, um, where we were having a town hall meeting, and our kind of news, like our executive news editor was talking about us trying to find more experts of color, in surrounding
This is with
companies.
NPR.
Yeah, yes, this is at
Okay.
NPR, WBUR.
Okay.
And so finding more experts of color, like at the organizations and schools and stuff like that around us, to come on the show so that we can have more diversity in our perspective. And people took that, I heard some people taking that as an offense, like, uh, that we shouldn't, we should be talking about the best people, um,
Mm,
regardless of color. And it was actually a very, like, at one point somebody said, like, let's not forget about the white males. It's like, think of the white males kind of thing.
mm.
And I'm sitting here in this meeting with two other people of color, but one a Latina woman, and another one a black woman, and me. And we're the only people of color in this room of 30 or 40 people. And it's like, we weren't set upon, uh, you know, in a discriminatory sense, but it was just another example of what we were talking about earlier, is that there is, to an extent, this impression that people of color aren't viewed as experts.
Right.
They're not put forward as experts. They don't get the publicity. That's often given to other people. And when people talk about the best, basically that just means the people who get put in front of the media the most, and that's not reflective to me. And I feel like there's a laziness at times, because people fall into this trap of, oh, I've talked to this guy before, he's really good, he's the best, and,
Right.
and there's an element of convenience, and it's an element of convenience in, both the access, the fact that you had this person that you talked to before, but I think it is, uh, not knowing what you're going to get from a person of color, or knowing, how to interact with that person. And so I feel like, even though I wasn't being discriminated against in that realm, I think that it was a sign to me that WBUR, as much as I like it, is still a very white newsroom,
Mm.
and it's still dominated by old fashioned kind of stereotypes and ways of thinking about things that still need to be addressed. Like I think that WBUR is trying to do that. I think that we have people in leadership that are committed to increasing diversity, but I think that that incident stuck with me and still sticks with me, um, as something that needs to change because it can't just be us people of color in a room explaining why we need to talk to more people of color and also why we don't need to fear for white males being on the radio because they're always on the radio and they're the first people you find when you Google, an
Right.
organization when you're looking for a guest. It's like basically always a white dude. And so there's like this element of context that, yeah, maybe this newsroom might be a very liberal, progressive place, but those stereotypes still exist there too. You know, there's not, it's not escapable.
So this is a distinction where it's you'd wish the station and it would just see you guys that aren't the white males in there uh, as just journalists, not of genuinely just journalists, not of tokenism of oh hey Khari, black journalist, of oh hey some of your female colleagues, the female journalists, just like that you're all on an equal footing, an equal level of expertise. Just to clarify, right?
Yes, though I think and this is something that maybe might be a good time to bring up. I don't necessarily feel like a token.
Okay.
And I don't think that was something that was, necessarily meant in that meeting. I was mostly talking about it from an extent of,
I was just
us
clarifying.
being in
Yeah.
this, yeah, yeah. So like us being in that room, we were the only ones kind of like, I felt like approaching it the right way because we weren't talking about it in terms of being exclusionary to everybody else who wasn't a person of color. We were talking about inclusion, and other people didn't see it that way. They, at one point somebody said, don't be inclusive to the point of being exclusive, which was in my mind a really stupid comment because, like,
Yeah.
again, context. In a way, I wanted to just be like, look around you. You think anybody's seriously in this room, like, you think we're going to have a hard time putting white people on the radio, or like putting white people in your digital stories, like y'all are all white, like I think we're okay, in terms of that. But another thing that I want to say, that really ties into my overall perspective about the way Black people are perceived is, and I'm not saying that you said this, but I just thought it would be an interesting time to bring this up, is I want to be seen as a Black journalist. I don't necessarily want that to be the only thing people see me as, or that like I only want to talk about Black stuff,
Right.
and things like that. But I want to be seen as a Black journalist because that's what I am.
Right.
I'm a Black man and I'm a journalist. I think that people think that that automatically means like, oh, you're just like a token and they just have you in here to be Black. But I view it as, I want people to see me for what I am. And I do want to be treated equally, like that is obviously the truth, right? But I
Right.
guess that's the whole point, is like people talk about not seeing color, or being colorblind, like being like seeing what somebody is as a bad thing. I'm a Black guy. I grew up Black. I've always been Black. People have always treated me like I'm Black, and I'm not ashamed to be Black, and to have that experience. But it's like, I think people, if they choose not to see that part, or they think that it's bad to see that part, they're neglecting what that experience provides. And that is perspective in a lot of senses. and it's a different kind of perspective, and it's one that takes into account factors that some people don't, and they didn't grow up with. And I also think that there's this connotation that, oh, I can't take color into account because, like, that's somehow bad. But I also think that that's because some people can't divorce color from prejudice.
Right.
So it's like, I have to just not see color, because if I see color, that means like I'm just automatically going to see the shitty things about you that I don't like because you're black. And so for me, like if I'm giving advice to a young kid coming up in journalism, I would say embrace what you are, because particularly if I'm talking to like a young black man, young black woman trying to come into journalism, like embrace what you are. It's not bad. We didn't ask anybody to not see color. We just asked not to be judged for it.
Right. So I mean that ties into the diversity thing where everyone's on equal footing, but you acknowledge your different backgrounds and your different cultural upbringings, and that's kind of what would be an ideal progressive point if we ever get there,
Yeah, and
as I
that's really
understand it.
that's really the key, because people think that that's divisive, but that's only, and I think that's only because we mentioned the word homogenous. That's
Hmm.
because being homogeneously like white, I guess, that is the default. And so when you're like, I'm not that, I'm a black guy, and I am, I have a different experience from you, and that just kind of is what it is. Like people talk about that like it's divisive to point out truth. Like it's divisive to point out what is and what the history of this world is and the way that it has affected us. When in reality, what this should be is an opportunity to be like, yo, man, like, I'm black. You're not, but that's okay.
I I feel like they only say it's divisive because it just makes them uncomfortable at a root
Right.
level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly it. It's because it makes them uncomfortable to think about non homogeneity, because people get so used to being in their own little bubbles, and this goes for non-white people too. If you live in a community where all you see is black people all the time, it can be difficult to have that perspective of kind of looking beyond that community. It's just mainly that you know mainly the way that we have operated for so long is that um, white voices tend to be the ones we hear the most, when we're in radio, when we're, just kind of out in the world, they're the ones that we hear the most and have the most influence. And so like, that's kind of the main issue, but it can go either way. I feel like for me, my experience was different because I was a black kid, but I grew up in middle class white suburbia. So I knew these kids, and I knew their families. I hung out in their houses. Um, and ostensibly, a lot of the time, that wasn't a big deal because I was one of the quote unquote good ones.
Mm.
But every once in a while, the mask would slip and they would show me who they were. And, that's tough stuff. But that's kind of, getting, sort of off track of that. Basically, my thought is, I think that, if you're a black journalist, like you should be proud of that. And you should make an attempt. Like it doesn't have to be an exclusive attempt, but make more of an attempt to help represent those voices because it matters.
That's a nice segue. What do you define as successful in this field for a black journalist or a minority journalist? We can take that onto a higher level. But what is successful in this field for a black journalist?
Well, obviously there are the baseline requirements of getting the job and
Yeah, well, yeah,
doing the job. But I think that as a minority journalist, it is kind of incumbent upon you in a way to represent the world as you see it. Like you don't have to only do stories about black people or other minorities. Like that doesn't have to be a thing. But I think that to to really be successful, you have to be who you are. And I feel like you have to make that attempt to tell the stories that relate to you, you know, and relate to people like you. Because if you're not doing that, it's like, okay, yeah, you can be successful in terms of, you know, the baseline requirements of your job, of course, but there's an opportunity missed. And, you know, we don't get a whole lot of opportunities to put ourselves forward and to put our voices out there and to make sure that people understand what it's like to be people like us. Like, I feel like if I can eventually be in a position where I get to use this platform to, you know, continue to raise awareness and help kids like me, you know, that grew up like me, you know, and don't, you know, maybe don't know which way is up right now, but, you know, kind of help their, you know, they're able to find their way into a profession. It doesn't even have to be journalism, but to help find their way into a profession that allows them to show off their skills and their unique talents. That is success. You know, it's not just about the job. It's not just about putting the stories out there and just, you know, searching for truth and you know, like getting a breaking story or something that gets like 1 million page views. It's about the impact that you make. And the impact that I want to make is for, you know, some kid, you know, or many kids like me to eventually see what I do and have it be something that they feel like they can be like me and be better than me.
Do you consider yourself successful? Like that you've made it? If not, do you think you have all the tools to eventually quote unquote make it that you maybe might not have had years ago?
In a way, there is a small part of me that does feel that I've made it because I'm thinking about my family and I'm thinking about where we all started out. And I think about my grandfather who died before I got this job, but he was like the person
When did
who
he die?
um November of I'm sorry, October of 2017.
Okay,
You know,
go
I
ahead
think
though. Sorry.
about yeah, it's like I think about him and the fact that he was this unequivocal bastion of support for me. No matter what I did, he just thought it was the coolest thing in the world. And when I was doing my own little podcast just for basically no one, he, you know, heard me, you know, do one of them and he just said, this is really neat. And, you know, like he just wouldn't stop telling me how cool it was. And it was like a few months before his death. And I just, you know, when I got this job, you know, when I made it to WBUR, I do feel like I'm doing it for him, you know, in a lot of ways. And I'm doing it for my family and everybody who wanted something more. At the same time, you know, I am never the type of person that's satisfied with just where I'm at. I have to push, you know, I have to keep on going because I have so much more that I want to do. And I do believe I have the tools to get that done. You know, I think that I have the technical skills I need. I think that, you know, I ask the questions that I feel like people will find interesting. And I think that I have the will and the desire to try to reach out and touch people, you know, and reach out beyond more than just me, because that's really what it's all about. Um, you know, you don't tell the stories for you know, you tell them for other people.
Well, I didn't mean just like personal skills. I meant like outside factors as well. Like, do you think everything's lined up in that way for you as well? But but yeah, that also applies. Like your personal skills also apply.
Oh yeah, you know, I couldn't be in a better place for this. I couldn't have done better, you know, in this spot, you know, if I tried. And to be able to learn from, you know, a guy who's a veteran, you know, in this field, you know, kind of see how he does his job day in and day out, and to learn from people who have been in the news business for decades, you know, it's huge for me. And, you know, I think that every day they make me a little bit better. and they continually give me opportunities. They trust me to hone my talents and to tell stories. And I think that can't, I can't say enough about that. And so I think that just like where I am right now, this is exactly where I need to be. At the same time, uh, I have dreams. I want to be on air. I want to have my own show one day. I want to, obviously I'm a sports guy, so I'd love to do that. But I want to have a show where I could talk about real life and sports, and talk about the intersection of sports and politics and just the world around you and community and people's stories in a way that people resonate with. Because in the end, I want to show you what's real. I don't want to just show you, and I just don't want to entertain. I want to, touch people, in their hearts, and get them to think.
That's your long-term goal, correct? Like that's your
Yes.
long-term ambition. Okay. Uh, put yourself in the younger shoes of a Khari. What advice would you give him? What would you tell him, say, right before you started college at the University of Chicago about knowing everything you know now, knowing how your entire life has developed and how you've transitioned towards this journalism? What would you tell him?
Keep thinking out, just think outside of yourself, and reach out into the world around you, and listen to listen to people's stories, and you know put yourself in their shoes. It's not that I never did that, but I think that it's something that I feel like I couldn't impress enough, is to just take in the world around you more, and not just go full steam ahead, and keep an open mind. I think I'm happy with where I ended up, and I think that my experience has suited me well. But um, if I could go back to that kid, I would tell him, don't be so hard headed. There are other things in life that you can do than just having this one set plan, and to just know that um, you can do anything you want. You have the talent, you have the skills, you have the drive. You can do anything you want, and you know you shouldn't limit yourself. Never limit yourself.
What kind so you mentioned that you're the person that likes to give the questions, to give the hard hitting questions, to really get at the truths and tell these worthwhile stories. As a journalist, as a person, what kind of an image do you think you give off, Khari? And when people hear your name, when people see your name, when people see you, when they read your work, when they listen to your work, how do you want to be viewed? Does legacy matter to you in that way?
I think it will. I think that I want, when people see a story that I write, um, I want people to know that, again, I'm gonna dig in, and I also want people to see that it's not just information that I'm going for. I'm trying to talk to you. I feel like that's the thing that I want people to understand the most when I interview them now. When I write these stories, I want to tell the stories in a way that I'm having a conversation with you, and I'm not just trying to talk at you. I'm trying to talk to you. And so I want to be that person that, you know, when I'm, reaching out, doing my job, the people want to talk to me, that they want to tell me things, that they feel like, and they trust me to tell their story the right way. Because that's the thing that matters to me, is when people, trust me with their interview, and they trust me with, this information, that I'm going to tell their story the right way. I think that ultimately, that's what it is, because I'm not, I don't want to be somebody who's doing it, just to like get famous or just to get well known. Again, this is about the people, whose story I'm telling. It's not about me. I'm just the voice that tells it for 45 seconds, or I'm just the guy who writes it on paper.
Got last few questions. I know we're running a little bit long here. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm getting some scary eyes over here, bro.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. All right. So I'm gonna throw a number at you. In 2000, newsrooms were made up of 12%. 12%. Okay. Wait. I'm getting the mouth jumbles. A newsroom was made up of 12% minorities in 2000. How much do you think that shifted to 2019?
I want to say it's 20% now.
17%. So obviously, while there is progress being made, that's still a very slow crawl. That's almost 2 decades, and it's only like 5%. That's still 80% made up of the homogeny we keep discussing. Are you optimistic or pessimistic that we ever reach a truly meaningful point of progress in diversity in this field?
Of course.
Why or why not?
Because in a way it has to happen, and I feel like
Wait, so you're optimistic. Just direct quote. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't ever think that I don't know that it'll ever be something where we'll have like 50% people of color in newsrooms, but this country is also having a reckoning right now, because that minorities are going to be the majority soon. Latinos and African Americans. Like there are so many of us that it's going to be hard to ignore. It's going to be hard to ignore this forever, and it's going to be hard to keep people out of these fields. So in a way, it kind of has to improve. Like there's not, like there's kind of no way around it. I mean, I don't, and again, it's probably going to be more incremental progress. I don't think we're going to see necessarily a boom where everything is going to change and be wonderful and perfect. But just from, sheer number values, like you can rage against, the changes in demographics, if you want, but you can't stop it. And as that happens, there's just going to be more opportunity for people to, like for minorities to break into journalism. And I feel like, again, these are conversations that are being had right now, on the daily and the yearly. And I feel like, the lack of those meaningful conversations is starting to come to the forefront, just because people are saying like, look, we still have some very complex issues related to race and culture in this in this country, and they're not being told in a complete fashion. And there's no other way to do that than for more minorities to get involved, because I think people sometimes forget that this country's history is our history too.
So wait, you're not necessarily going to define progress or diversity in journalism as a concrete number. So then you're going to define it as where this conversation is happening and people aren't getting uncomfortable about it. Is that what I'm understanding?
I think in terms of number,
I'm not necessarily looking for a concrete number. I'm saying how would you define it when we get to a meaningful point of progress here?
I think that I would define it as progress when, first of all, like, we can get above 25%. That would be great. And I feel like chances are that's probably it'll still be incremental, but it'll be a little bit faster. But I also think when we get to a point where people can call a spade, when people can call racism what it is on major networks, and it not be this thing where we're, dancing around it or trying to use euphemisms. I feel like, that argument, and that's been brewing for a while, as more Black journalists become more prominent, and more Latinos, call out, racist language and stereotypes about, Mexicans that are being used by the current administration. Like, I think that there's hopefully going to come a point where our diversity has reached a point where you can't just get away with stuff like that in newsrooms anymore. And, you're going to have Latinos, potentially more of them, or, more African Americans in positions of power in media. And so they're going to be able to help set the terms of how the news is discussed and how these issues are talked about. So I think that some of it also just has to be when leadership becomes more diversified, because that's the other thing that kind of gets lost in this. So in a very general sense, I would say it's going to start at the top, with more leadership, minority leadership in news.
So that's in newsrooms, that's in schools, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so once that happens, it's going to be really hard to keep the same tone, with the way that news is covered, because there are going to be too many people speaking out against the status quo.
All right. That really probably should do it for me. Is there anything you want to add, get off your chest, anything that maybe I didn't ask you in particular that you wanted to say?
No, actually, I think I kind of picked and chose my spots to get that stuff out.
Yeah.
I had things that I wanted to say, and then some things that just kind of came up along the way that I hadn't necessarily planned, but I feel pretty good about it.
Okay, that's perfect, buddy. I'm sorry for running late. I'm sorry, Crystal, for running late. I know it's you guys Friday night, so I appreciate you taking the time, and I'm sorry for the interruption to the start of the weekend. But this was good stuff, Khari. I appreciate you telling me your story. I know this is probably something that you've wanted to get off your chest, and I'm just a writer, man. I'm just a journalist. I'm just trying to tell a story here. I'm happy you're comfortable enough to tell me these kinds of things and to tell me your experiences, to where I can put this on the page and hopefully, someone reads it and someone gets some meaning from it, gets some worthwhile meaning from it. And yeah, thanks, man.
Hey, you're my guy, man.
All right, I will let you go now, and I did have to say, just so I don't get murdered through the screen or through the audio. I'm sorry, Crystal. I'm sorry.
She can't hear you, but I will relay your apologies, rather.
Okay. All right. You have a good night, buddy.
Right,
thanks again.
Right,
bye.